Hey, this is Lizbeth, and I just recorded on Love Is with Kim Sorrelle. So excited to converse with Kim again, who was on my podcast. I love that we did a deep dive into not just my missing daughters, but what people do when they're going through hard times and want to come out on the other side.
Welcome to the show. I'm so glad you're here. You're going to be so glad you're here. I have my friend, Lizbeth Meredith, on the show. You're going to be amazed by her story and her resilience and the things that she's done in her life. And Lizbeth, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Kim. I am so glad to see you again. I absolutely adored having you on my show. So this is a true privilege. Appreciate it.
Well, I loved being on Persistent You, which is a great show, by the way. So if you're looking for a great show, put it on your list. Persistent You. Everybody should listen to it. It's just full of wonderful stories, people's stories, and encouragement, and it's just so good. So I've been so excited about you then being on my show and us being able to continue the conversation, have more conversation because we connected and I
Yes.
thought, man, I love this woman. Like she should live next door and we should go have coffee. So I'm glad that you're here.
It's the next best thing to coffee, maybe even better, but thank you, Kim. I hope we do connect one day in person because I felt so soothed after we spoke. And I had a number of people tell me they loved your episode. And I likened it to aloe, you being aloe for the soul, very healing and calming.
Oh, well, thank you. That's so sweet. So sweet of you to say. Okay, Elizabeth, I know you, but I want everybody else to know you. And I don't know how many people I've known that have lived in Alaska, but I think like three. So you've got some roots in Alaska. You spent a lot of time there.
Yes. Absolutely. I had more than 50 years of my life in Alaska. My two adult daughters still live in Alaska. And it's most everything I've ever known. I call it the state that raised me at some point. And, I lived in Alaska at a time, especially pre-internet and pre-pandemic, where people were so, and this was a while back, but people were so willing to go to bat for one another because we were all struggling against the elements. And so we didn't amplify our differences as much. We tried to get through together. And I love and miss that part of Alaska.
Yeah, that's so interesting. When I was a kid growing up, you knew who all your neighbors were,
Right.
and people would just walk in the door. Like there wasn't even knocking all the time that happened.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah, it was just a friendly neighborhood, and I loved growing up where I grew up, and it seems like we've gotten away from that. Some neighborhoods I know are still close, but there's nothing like knowing that you've got people on either side of you or around you that will go to bat for you, that
It's
are
so
there
true.
looking out for you.
Very true.
Yeah, there goes my alarm, which that's fun. And then I have to stop it. There we go. Sorry for the interruption. But
That's
yeah,
okay.
so tell me about Alaska. What were your favorite things and what were the hardest things?
Well, you should know I didn't choose to live in Alaska, of course, like most of us as tiny kids. So there were parts that I struggled with. It is very, very dark for a long part of the year. There's so much snow some winters. So, for instance, this winter, it started off with more than 20 inches in 1 week. That's a lot to deal with. But as a child, what I knew was there was lots of snow, that we would have snow days where it would be so much that we couldn't get the streets dusted off to go. Nice people, beautiful, and to this day, beautiful animals, even in the city limits, where the big city of Anchorage, where I lived the most of my years in Alaska, more than 50 years in Alaska, bear traipsing through your front yard, a moose at the end of the street, a mother moose and babies, an eagle perched watching your cat to see if maybe cat would be a good dinner. So it is definitely magical.
Yeah, it is. It is. I've only been to Alaska once. I went to a few different cities, but it is absolutely beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. And what I loved about it too, Lisbeth, was every town I went to had its own personality.
Yes, definitely. Almost like it's a different states within a state. Alaska is so big, it reminds me of Australia. Like if someone says, I'm going to Australia, and I did one time, I remember thinking, I'll just go everywhere. And then you get there and you're like, I will be lucky to see 10% of this amazing place. And Alaska is like that. It's very spread out. It's, one city would be, or an island would be no snow, mostly no snow, lots of rain, rainforest, which people don't think of with Alaska. And then another's would be completely different, with avalanches. It's just amazing.
Yeah, it is. It is. It's beautiful. So if you haven't been there, go to Alaska. If you can go to Alaska, go because it is, it's just gorgeous. So you grew up and went to school. How big was your school?
Well, we moved around a little bit, and I don't know how big my earliest schools were, but they weren't large. Um, we were a family of a little chaos, so we moved and moved, but there were nice kids, lots of nice kids. And, I didn't understand then that we have a lot of amazing Indigenous people too, but we didn't talk about those things back in the day, but a lot of diversity of culture, and that made it really exciting. And, we had some really good schools, and I hope that we're still performing well in schools, but we really had some sharp schools.
Yeah, that's nice. That's fun. And yeah, it's wonderful the kids that you meet, right?
Yes,
And everybody wants to connect. And I think sometimes about like kids that are over by themselves at a lunch table or whatever. It's like somebody go sit by them, like
right.
everybody was in that position that that kid is in at one point in their life where they felt like the
Yes,
odd man out. And so go connect because we all need that
right.
connection and sense of belonging. And so,
Right. Because those scars that children have when they don't feel connected to something really last their whole lives. And so it is very true that if we can just remember to seek out the people who might be struggling a little bit, it's very important to do as kids.
yes, yeah, and really as adults too.
Yes,
You can feel that loneliness sometimes as an adult. Like we were talking about neighbors. Reach out
right,
to your neighbor, give somebody a smile, give them a hand, whatever it happens to be. But we're all in this together. I just talked to
right.
somebody and he said, this is a team sport that we're playing here. And I thought, you know what? It's true.
It's true.
We're not loners. This is a team sport. So might as well get on the playing field and be part of it. Right.
Yes,
Yes.
absolutely.
Yeah. So after school and after whatever, you have quite a story, a difficult story that was actually made into a movie because it was that impactful of a story, which I think you're the first person I know who has a story that was made into a movie. So I'd love for you to share what happened.
Absolutely. I think the main thing, as I was a child, I grew up in a very chaotic home. And the reason I grew up in Alaska was because my mom wanted to get me and a few of her other kids away from their respective fathers without going to court. And so we fled to Alaska and left behind siblings and our fathers. And we were there. And that was, as a child, even it felt like, oh, I did not choose this. Even though I was too young to realize much, it didn't feel right. And so I just remember thinking as a kid, I'm going to do different. I am going to marry one time. I'm going to have children. They're not going to be exposed to divorce, parental kidnapping, or domestic violence, any of the things, only to do nothing to make sure that I understood the family problems, do any personal development work, get any information on why people do the things they do. And so I just kind of grabbed the first hand that reached out to me after a couple of years of college, which I was very wobbly academically. It's a nice way of saying I could barely get through the first couple of years of school. So I washed out of college at first. And sure enough, went back to Alaska and married someone that I hardly knew. And it was so exciting at the time because he was from another culture and so worldly, older than myself. And I just thought, this is going to be great. I was wrong. I was wrong. And so just a few years after that, and really it's okay to joke about now, but it really was like if I closed my eyes, opened up the old-fashioned phone book, and then pointed at a name, I probably would have ended up with a better spouse. Doesn't even matter if it was a refrigeration business, that would have been better to marry. So, it turns out that the person you select to spend forever with can change generations. I am a big believer in education, but one of the most important things we need to be informed on is how to get to know ourselves and how to get to know red flags. And so I just went from the frying pan into the fire and jumped into a marriage and had two wonderful little daughters pretty soon. I was a pretty young parent and not wise parent. And so, 4.5 years later, I am in a shelter, a domestic abuse shelter with my little daughters thinking, I guess it'll be okay. I'm still young. I can get this protective order and finish college and learn to support my children. And maybe if I just make really good choices, everything's going to be okay. Everything will be all right. And what I didn't realize, and I think people forget, is that, this kind of stuff in a relationship, it doesn't happen because person made one bad choice. There's another person on the other side who gets very upset when the person who's been controlled or who's been abused starts making strides. And so the stronger that person gets, the more intimidated and intimidating the other person becomes. So over, years of being apart, things only escalated. I didn't expect that as a young person leaving. I graduated from college. I was so excited, got a fabulous job at the very agency that helped me when I was young, with understanding about intimate partner violence and red flags of abusive relationships, and really the place where I learned to become my own best advocate. So I was working there and loving it. And then one day, 4 years after I left my former husband, he took our daughters and fled the country. And so,
Took your daughters and fled the country. Like, okay, so let me unpack a little bit, because now that it's this many years later, you're
right,
able to talk about it and whatever. I imagine it took a while to even wrap your mind around what was happening.
right,
But you made a point that the other person, things can escalate.
right,
And I've never heard that before. Like, I think so often in your mind, you think, well, I got away, so then they're
right,
gonna just leave me alone. Like, I don't have to worry about them anymore, because
right,
they know what they were doing was wrong. So I'm just gonna leave them and now start this whole new life, and it will be over.
right.
But that's not what happens.
No, and I really tried as a young person who had always been a pleaser to be a likable victim and to not go back and forth and be wishy-washy about my choices. I had really made my mind up, like I wasn't going to remarry right away or jump onto a dependency of another sort. I would really have to sort out my mess, do a deep dive in counseling, do all the things I needed to do so that my children wouldn't carry this legacy. And there are times when a person leaves a relationship that is volatile and abusive, and the person who's responsible for the abuse finds someone else quickly. And so the misery is transferred often. And sometimes they find a person who doesn't have, and this will sound very mean, but who doesn't spark any annoyance because that person does everything they are told. And I have met women in my work with domestic abuse survivors who kind of prided themselves on, yeah, he really injured the first wife. And I, had heard about that, read about it, but never me. But when you did a deep dive, that's because she never asked for anything for herself. She never stood strong in her own truth. So I just thought if I followed all the rules and colored in the lines, everything would be okay. And I was definitely wrong. He was very obsessive. in the ensuing 4 years before he took our kids, he would not pay support, not visit, then call the police saying I'd refused his visit, tell the children when he saw them terrible messages about me, and then broke into the house, cut my tires. It was it was relentless. And then he disappeared with the girls. It wasn't the kind of feeling like, oh, he just wanted to spend more time with them. Isn't that nice? He could take them to Greece and get to know his family. No, it was terrifying for them.
Oh, I'm sure. Were they at school? Did he pick them up from school? What was the situation?
He had the ability through the courts, and I'm not casting fault, but courts can assign supervised visitation, and they had on and off, but that's a very short-term thing that can happen. It cannot be a lifetime for children that there's supervised visitation for a number of reasons, such as who's going to supervise the visitation? How are we going to be able to afford that? How are we going to make sure parents both have access? So he had options to visit the kids. Then he did, and that's when he disappeared one day. It was March 13th, the day he took them, and I found out on the 15th that he was not bringing them home.
Wow. Wow. I can't even imagine. It's one thing, I had a scare actually
Yeah.
with I have a granddaughter who lives with me. I came home 3 o'clock in the morning because I was driving home from somewhere and she wasn't here. And she's never not here. And I'm panicking and I'm on the phone. I'm trying to find her. She's not answering. I mean,
Right,
and then it was like 5 minutes of panic before she
right,
called me back and said, I'm at a friend's house. I'm just spending the night at a friend's house. I was sleeping. Sorry, I should have left a note, whatever. 5 minutes, five
right,
minutes. And my adrenaline was up. I couldn't fall asleep, whatever, right?
right.
Here, your kids are on the other side of the world. I mean, they might as well be on the other side of the world as far away as they were. So how did you know what to do or what did you do?
It was hard. It was very difficult. And I won't go into too much detail because it goes on for so long. Just know I wrote a memoir that became the movie. But I will tell you this, if a parent has children and they're taken from, let's say, Alaska to California, that's bad enough because you have two state governments battling each other, different jurisdictions, different legal systems, different preferences, all of that. For me, in some ways, I was fortunate because by that point, he'd worn me down so much, and I'd helped other women by then learn how to advocate for themselves. So I had a good support system where I worked. I had amazing people that I was working alongside, including our executive director, who became a really good friend of mine years later. But I could rely on them, and they had connections, or they had empathy without being sympathetic. They understood I still had strength and I needed to come to work. I needed to be able to function in some place and compartmentalize. But then I needed to be able to pursue getting my children home. It was messy. It was never easy. From the beginning, I called the police. The police encouraged me to be more patient. And then they encouraged me to call the State Department. And then the State Department talked to me and said, hey, but you really need to cooperate with the police. Then when the police finally issued a warrant for my former husband's arrest, the State Department said, you'll never get your kids back now. Why did you do this? So it was just this weird back and forth, and everyone kind of passing the peas. And I was the peas. So but I had really great friends, great local support. My family, much of my family, I didn't know until I was older in life. Even if I had known them, I mean, I love them, but what could they have done? Honestly, it's
Right.
$100,000 problem. I made $10 an hour and we barely squeaked by off public assistance. And there was no way I could do it alone. So having to learn to advocate for myself and ask for help again, which I certainly didn't like doing. And, I got some good advice and I just kept moving and thinking about them as a campaign and that we would need to, I felt like I was running for an elected position. So we'd have fundraisers and I'd answer questions and I made good connections with the press. This was pre-internet days, right? We didn't have GoFundMe, no Facebook, none of that. And probably for the best for me. We had
Yeah.
good old-fashioned people showing up in person saying, what can I do?
Oh, yes. Yeah. I mean, it is a team sport. We got to work together, right?
Right.
That's wonderful that you had good support system. It changes everything, but still, your
Yes.
girls aren't home.
Yes.
And I think it could be easy for somebody to go, well, why don't you just fly to Greece and get them?
Right.
Right?
Right. I mean, I
But
did fly to Greece, of course, but you have a legal process to go through first. And the irony, it's funny now, but not very funny then, was as soon as finally the legal system worked and we have this international treaty and got all my documents translated into Greek, filed the court paperwork in Greece, had to hire attorneys in Greece, then as we're ready to move on this, all of the lawyers went on strike. Greece is a fabulous country filled with amazing people and some great humans, many of whom helped support me there, without a doubt. Amazing. But everyone's on strike at some point or another. There's at one point during this whole mess, one of my Alaskans attorney flew down on his own dime. I had nothing to pay him. He flew down and we were driving around. We saw an orphanage and there were people on strike. And he said, what are they looking for? Parents? It's just like, it is the place where people have their voices heard. So it's a beautiful country. But, it took a long time. I mean, there was a failed trip the first time, and then finally I got arrested. And then finally I went back a second time. And so all told, I was in Greece about 6 months total. So if you can imagine, that meant that people funded this, that employees who didn't make much more than I did were donating their leave, their personal leave, that people had garage sales. It was precious.
yeah, no kidding. No
Yeah.
kidding. And what a process.
Yes.
Because yes, like you said, two state governments, that's tough enough. But
Right.
but in doing something internationally, and
Right.
and I would think that in Greece, they'd go, well, he's the dad and he's
Right.
great. He belongs
Right.
here. They belong here. They're great. They belong here. And who's this woman
Right.
coming from the US saying, no, they're my daughters and they need to go home with me?
Right. And I had always heard from our consulate officials that that was the case pretty much, that Greeks stood up for Greeks, probably not that unlike us here, and that they would likely not be siding with me. It is a testament to my husband's unlikability that the teachers and the people who he interacted with quietly said to me, you better take these kids and run. They're
Oh,
not doing well and they're not being treated well and they're not coming to school. So get them and get out.
oh my word. How heartbreaking that must have been to hear.
Yes,
Because you would hope that if he had that kind of passion in him to take the kids, that he would take care of the kids.
correct.
And but that didn't happen.
It would have been the case had he taken them for any good benefit for them, but it was in fact to spite me. I had left and he had a couple of options in his mind. He had threatened previously to end my life, but instead, why not do something that's so much worse? And so the children literally suffered the consequences because of my decision to leave.
Mm.
So it was a lot to untangle, a lot. But eventually we all came home together. There's a lot in between, but we eventually came home together and fought another court battle in federal court. And now the girls are deep in their 30s and, just lovely human beings. And they still struggle with some of the after effects, as one would imagine.
Oh yeah, right, right. Because it took how long? How long from the day they
Two
left?
years. When
2
we
years.
reunited, I had non-English speaking daughters. So
Wow.
yes.
And how old were they when it
When
happened?
they left, they were 4 and 6, which in my opinion is the height of adorability for children. And when they came back, the little one had just turned 7, and my oldest daughter was 8, about to turn 9.
Wow. Wow. And they didn't speak English anymore.
At first, yes. I had to
Yeah.
hire someone to help teach them at our hotel room.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. Oh, what a situation. Those poor kids. When something happens, it's like, it's one thing if you're fighting the two of you, but when
Right,
you involve the kids, my
right,
word. And then as a mama, to not
right,
be with your kids for 2 years, that's heartbreaking. I can't
right. It
even
was.
begin to imagine what that would be like and what it did to them and their psyche. Um, what a difficult situation all the way
Right.
around. Yeah. So,
It was not good. It was not good. And I would say that also when the kids came back, and people were so excited to hear that they came back because it was Alaska and because this didn't happen as often back then, it was a big deal in our home community. When my kids went missing, it was well covered in the press. When they returned, it was well covered in the press. Most people were so fantastic. Occasionally, the girls would hear messages like, "You're lucky it was your dad, aren't you?" And I
mm,
think people don't mean to be awful, but if you can really put that in context, your mother and your father should be the most committed to your safety of everyone in your life. And so to hear someone kind of minimize their experience, that was hard. But again, I don't think people meant that to be harmful. But that's a hard thing for kids to come to terms with. It was hard for me. I had failed to keep them safe. He had not taken any accountability and never did ultimately. That today people often ask when I do events like, hey, are they in contact today? They're not. I tried to get them to be a couple of times, but he is unchanged. So it didn't help. And my daughters kindly asked me to step out of their choices at this point since they're grown. So I'm like, you gotcha.
yeah, no kidding.
I
No
hear you.
kidding. Yeah. 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 And I would think too, when you got them home, it had to be hard to not like let go of them and let them
Oh,
actually go to school or go somewhere without you.
and we still have some of those after effects. I was very controlling, had a lot of trauma related responses that were not helpful. Um, I was very anxious. They had some great times when they came home eventually, but it changed their lives. And I tell people when I do talks today, like, I got two children home, but I didn't get the same ones that were kidnapped. They
Mm.
would forever be changed. And it hit them at their health physically and, at mental health as well. It isn't something that you just therapize away. It is something that lives in their DNA.
Well, and those years that are
Right.
such formative years,
Yes.
and to be, thrown into the situation they were thrown into. I mean, I can't begin to imagine what it was like for them. And yeah. And
Right.
right, there are things that you can't just go to therapy and walk out and go, oh, it's all good now, right?
Right.
I mean, there's damage that carries through a lifetime. And you learn how to cope,
Right.
and you learn some strategies, you can learn some things, but the reality is people can do so much damage that
Yes.
affects somebody's entire life.
It's true.
Yeah.
It's very true. And I did not realize that when they came home. I just didn't. I felt like now you're home. All these people helped you to come home. Look, we had fundraisers. See how much they care? Behave in school. I'll get you therapy and sports and all the positive things. But don't forget, all these people helped bring you home. In other words, you should invent the cure to AIDS or cancer or something like that because people did stuff for us. And I didn't understand how damaging that was. We knew very little then about trauma informed care and that the body really does retain some of this scar tissue. And so that really added to their wounds in ways that I never meant to. And it was a long time before I realized, oh no, I mean, if it weren't bad enough, now I'm doing this thing where I'm turning them into circus monkeys when they're around people who
Home.
helped us.
Right, right, right. Yeah, that's interesting. I don't think I would have given that any thought either because you feel so indebted.
Yes.
to these people that did so much for you. It's like you want these perfect little angels, these beautiful
Right.
girls in their pretty little dresses for these people to be able to
Right.
say, I helped bring you
Right.
home. And really if the people that help bring them home also need to understand
Right.
these are two traumatized girls that just need to kind of go on with their life and not constantly be in a position where they have to be thanking people who
Yes.
help them get there, help them get home.
Yes. And I think those people were doing great. I was the one holding on to all of this anxiety and indebtedness. Nobody asked me to do that. It was all on my own. So,
Yeah, but I can see it how it would happen. I mean,
right.
you're a kind person, you're caring, you are grateful, and so that gratitude is going to spill over, and sometimes you don't know what to do with it. Like,
Right.
how do you go on?
Right.
Like, I don't know. You wrote a book, so
Right.
now it's in a book, but really, there wasn't a book for you to read. Like,
Right.
this is how you get through this situation. You don't go to
Right.
the bookstore and, there's in self-help, what do you do when your kids are kidnapped by their father
Right.
and taken to another country for 2 years?
It's
So you had to
very
pave
true.
your own way.
It's
Yeah.
very true. I was looking on it one time as I was writing the book, I was looking at a thread online now about kids who'd been returned after abduction and they had their own little support network. And I saw, and of course, I was a kidnapped kid. And so some things I did understand intuitively, but the thread really talked about the double whammy of you live at a place that you never asked to live at. You eat their food, you learn the language, you learn to appreciate the smells, the religion, the culture, all of that. Because you have to land on your feet. And then one day someone comes and takes you away from all of that. And there you're thrust into another place where you learn the language, the food, the culture, the faith, everything. You lose, you lose, you lose, and for nothing that you did wrong as a child. And so that really kind of helped me understand, like, oh, it I may have felt like the best thing to do is take them home, and I know that it was, but it didn't come without huge consequences for my kids.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Man, what a thing to go through. And I know since then you've been so supportive of other people and have helped other people. And I'm surprised in talking to you how much more common this is. I remember Sally Fields playing Not
Yes.
Without, the part, I think it was called Not Without My Mother, maybe
Not without my daughter.
or Not Without My Daughter.
Yep.
Not Without My Daughter. That makes more sense. Not Without My Daughter. And the things that woman in real life went through in a culture that made it very difficult to do
Right.
anything and so hard. And so, uh, we that was publicized, right? There was a
Right.
movie about it, and so people knew about that. But this is something that happens.
Right. It
Yeah.
does. And whether it's state to state or out of our country, it definitely happens more often than I think people realize. And it was Betty Mahmoudi, and she had a nonprofit agency. So when my kids were missing, I was able to connect with her nonprofit. It didn't stay open for long, but she had done some wonderful work. I never did open a nonprofit, and I just want to be clear because I think my help is in writing and some presentations and things that I do, but I after the movie came out, I was contacted by a phenomenal amount of people who might have thought that this was my full-time job. And I work and I do many, many other things, but I can't help people get their children back or get their kids out of abusive relationships. We talk a lot on Persistence U about resources and about healing, and in my writing about becoming your own best advocate. But I'm not a lawyer, and I never want to lead people along thinking that I do that individually because there are so many amazing places that cost nothing and that have the most in touch with the latest laws and statutes and how they're applied. There are nonprofits all over the place that do that. And so it's just important little reminder.
Well, and there's no way, even if you did do it, you could know everything, right? Because
Right.
every circumstance, every state, everything is going to be different. So it's wonderful that these organizations exist.
Yes.
People can turn to that have knowledge or will gain the knowledge because they know the way. And
Yes. Agree.
so praise the Lord for those people that are helping and doing great.
Absolutely.
Yes,
Absolutely.
because it's just not easy.
No.
So you raise these two wonderful girls who are now in their 30s. And
Yes.
yes, and so things changed, which is really good, a slow go. And there's the residual whatever, but what is life like now with you and your daughters? What's your relationship?
Well, I just got back from seeing them in Alaska, which was so great. We went to Homer, Alaska, where one of my daughters lives now, and it's a beautiful seaside town that's very different from Anchorage. They both eventually finished college. They both work and, they deal with life as it comes, but they're amazing people. They value time together or experiences over things. They definitely love culture, and that stuck with them. And they both have a gift for language. And I think one of the most healing things, they're very open to therapy and whatever other healing exercises can help unpack trauma, but they also love animals, and animals are by their very nature so healing. So they're pretty great individuals, very sassy, very different personalities, but awesome. I mean, it's great. And so I hear from them very regularly. And I live in East Tennessee now. Finally I chose a place that I wanted to live instead of kind of where I inherited. And so I put together a new life. I had worked in child abuse protection, domestic abuse advocacy, probation work for 3 decades. So when I came here, I did a number of different things. And, right now I'm teaching college part-time and podcasting. I've done ghostwriting and editing and, many different things. And just wrote another book and am audio recording that book. That's a much more fun book. I love my first book, don't get me wrong, but it's nice to talk about things that aren't so tragic sometimes. So it's a good life. And if it doesn't get much better, I will say it's never been dull.
Yeah, no kidding. Never been dull. So now, instead of 20 inches within a week of snow, if there's a dusting in Tennessee, everything shuts down.
Even the cat food gets bought. I'm like, what are you eating, cat food? I mean, I don't understand. You can have just a whiff of, hey, we might get a storm, which people I think tornado then, and the shelves are like cleaned off. So it's very different. It was hard to move, across country and in the pandemic and all of that. Hard to be away from the girls, but I had been hovering so obnoxiously. And it was time for me to grow up and to do something different and for them to have space to develop that confidence. And so it did help in some ways, and I miss them terribly. So it's a good
Yeah.
thing.
Oh, I'm sure. Well, and they're in two different cities,
Yes,
right? So it's like, well, you could live with by one and not by the other
it's
anyway.
true.
And right. So you'd be traveling no matter what. And Tennessee is
Right.
a beautiful state.
It is.
Yes. Yeah. And friendly and welcoming. So yeah, I would think Tennessee would be a really nice place to live.
It is. I really like it. And especially this year, Kim, I had been living on a very busy, busy, busy street in Chattanooga, and I moved to a more remote place. And it is so lovely. And I look out and I see the mountains. And the other night I was walking at 10 at night and a deer ran right in front of me just as fast as he could. And like we almost collided. It's so much fun. I love that kind of thing. Love.
Yeah. Yeah. Not everybody's going to say that, Lizbeth.
Right. It's weird. It's an Alaskan carryover.
Really. Yeah. So then, but your whole life now and then has been outwardly giving and outwardly doing and helping people and whatever. Were you always like that or like that because you saw how people helped you?
Well, I think it's the latter. I think it's because people helped me. I also think, and thank you for saying that. And of course, I do regenerate, and I do regenerate alone best. So I am a troll sometimes too. Sometimes I literally don't see people for a couple of days, and it's lovely. And that's the first time. But I will say that one of the most healing things we can do as humans when we go through something tough is selfishly to learn to give back to other people or to make sense of what we went through by sharing some of the things that helped. And so that's what I've tried to do so that it's not all for nothing. It's easy in life, and I know that you know this more than anyone. We could sit back when things, because when life goes wrong, it isn't one thing usually. It'll be a few things all at once. If you have one death, it might turn into three or four that you experience in your close periphery, or a disease, or whatever it is, a house burning down. But just knowing that there are people who've walked through your shoes and that can know how to help you get to the next spot. And then someday, you know that you'll be that person helping someone else who needs help seeing just down the street a little bit, knowing that
Right.
they can get through something hard.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. So yes, so you're giving back in so many different ways, which is a beautiful thing. And
Thank you.
you said this, and I totally agree. It's like if you go through something bad, what good can you make come out of it? Because
Right.
it's hard when it just stays in the bad.
Great.
So if there's something productive that can come out of it, something that you can do to help other people, even just relating, like
Right.
nobody can relate to a mom whose kids have been kidnapped like you can
Right.
when you go through it. And so people need people that are willing to talk about it and willing to uh, commiserate, I guess,
Right.
give right kind of sympathy and support. So it's wonderful that you did that, that you have found some good amongst the horrible chaos and trauma and are doing good things to help people.
Thank you. Thank you. And
Yeah.
I'm very fortunate. Not everyone reunites with their lost children. So I know that I am among the very fortunate.
Yeah. That's sad to think about that not everybody reunites. So yes, so it is good. And then what made you decide I'm going to start a podcast?
I was in the middle of the pandemic, probably like so many of us, and about to retire from a job I kept for 20 years and probation. So it was a lot of my identity that was in that job. And I just was thinking, what am I going to do next? And I also thought at the same time as I was writing, doing a lot of book events, things like that, how sad it is that the younger generation may never know what it is like to have true support in community. You know, when I was growing up, even politics were a safe thing to talk about because you could respectfully disagree. And it seems like we've lost some of that art. And so I thought, what would it be like to try to create a community in a podcast where people felt accepted and seen and that they weren't alone going through hard times? They wouldn't be encouraged to forever live in those hard times. But they also weren't going to be encouraged to put a pretty smile on and avoid them and pretend everything was great. You know, what would it be to hear from people who'd gone through difficult and challenging and exciting things and had a few takeaways that could be beneficial? So that's where Persistence U came from. I think a lot of times, even in the world of writing, people will say, wow, you're a really good writer. And I'm like, it took me 20 years to write that book. You have no idea how many drafts of my bad writing it took, and conferences, and hiring an editor, and tutorials, and critique groups. If we allow ourselves time, we can get the skills that we will really seek. And sometimes those are survival skills.
Yeah. Well, and writing itself can be so therapeutic,
It can be. It can
right?
be. Unless you've never processed some of the stuff that's gone on. And then it can be not very helpful. But, right. Somebody, I forgot who it was, but, right through your scars, not through your wounds.
Mm,
That is very important too. I wouldn't have started writing very successfully if I had not had a chance to process already what I'd gone through.
yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So, yeah. So here you go. So now you're writing another book or you have
Yeah.
another book coming out. So tell
Yes.
me about that book. I'd love to hear.
This one is more fun. It is definitely not meant to be an inspirational book necessarily. It's a fun PG-13, I would say, just so your audience knows, book about a middle-aged woman who decides to go on a quest to find the man of her dreams. She's a single mom, reaching middle age, and this book became from a very real, very pointed conversation that my daughters had with me when I was turning 40. They were about to be grown. And, one said basically, look, you're lonely, you're going to be alone and pathetic. You're the last of your cute years. You will die alone if you don't do something. We're about to leave the home. We don't want to leave you sad and miserable. Get to it, mom, get to it. And so this was a fun book to write because there were bones of truth, but most everything was amplified, escalated, or not my story whatsoever. And just a book of resilience also. But Alaska is an odd place to date. And there is a phrase there, in the villages, you used to be able to find that there were like 5 men to every woman, as an example. And so people would say, well, hey, you should come to Alaska to meet someone. Then the people from Alaska would say, well, the odds are good, but the goods are odd. So the book is called Tilka Faces the Odds, One Man at a Time. And it is now released on paperback and ebook, and I'm recording the audiobook. Just a lot of fun. It just was fun. And sometimes when you've dealt with really serious things for so long, it's nice to shift gears and to just have a giggle.
No kidding. No kidding. So you said there's bones of truth. So
Yes.
have you dated over the years?
Oh, I have. There were times I like to think that my dating mirrored my eating habits, like the kind of starvation, 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 and then like date, 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 date. I'm gonna really do this, and then nothing, 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 nothing. Date, date. So I tried. I did. I haven't, it's been a long time since I've had a date, and I'm gonna say like a date with any potential, maybe 10 years. But it was fun. I had nice relationships sometimes, and different ones at other times. But it's not like I never dated. It was just at some point I wasn't sure, should I, like when I was moving to East Tennessee, should I get a husband to help me as I get older, or should I get a landlord? And I'm like, landlord, not a homeowner. I just can call someone. So, I may change my mind one day, but it's not that it's been all bad at all. It's just when you've gone through what I went through, it's hard to look at someone and think, and I will hand over this beautiful life that I have created for myself and my daughters and trust that no one is going to harm it. That's in the back of my head. That may change.
Right. If the right guy comes along,
right?
Absolutely. Who knows? Who knows?
Or I could just adopt another cat.
Or that.
Either way, I will be very content. I'm not always joyous or joyful, but I will always be very content and grateful.
Yeah. Yes. Well, I too have dated over the years, and I got to say, dating when I was young compared to dating older, two completely different things. And I always say, sorry to the men out there, if there's any single men listening, if you're a good guy, congratulations.
Yes.
Because you're a rare breed. You are a unicorn. You are a unicorn. There are men that aren't married because they should not be married. Right? Yes. And there are men that have never been married because they shouldn't be, and men that are divorced or whatever their situation and should just be alone. And that's okay. Like
it will be okay. And the other thing is, I stopped trying. And I think, did you watch The Golden Bachelorette at all?
Oh, yes, of course.
Okay. So I felt like they should have arranged a cruise with the men who weren't selected and those of us who thought, hey, could go on that cruise, because they literally picked kind people. It looked like you had non-competitive, very kind people who were learning to forge friendships and be vulnerable, and that had not been their life experience necessarily. So I know there are good ones out there. It's just how much energy, and would I move across country to meet some? No, absolutely not. Right? I know myself. I'm tired. Yeah, I'm just tired.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, there were a couple of things that I learned like that on watching The Golden Bachelor, because I, sort of a guilty pleasure watching The Bachelor, Bachelorette for the years sometimes, and there would be fighting among the women or disagreements among the men, but the 2 seasons of first Golden Bachelor and Golden Bachelorette, there's a camaraderie, and I love that, the way the men just really liked each other, and they were devastated when somebody went home, and they're still connected. And one of them even said, "Where do I find a group of friends at my age? You know, you're not in school, you
Right.
might not be working anymore, so you don't have the work friends, you don't have that going. So where do you find friends? And what
It's
do
a very good point. I mean, I found myself crying watching the show, and I don't cry that easily, but I was like, it was so precious when one of the men acknowledged how lonely he didn't know he had been for friendships, and then got sent home, and he was devastated, not because he didn't get selected, but because he was losing that wonderful brotherhood inside that place. And I thought, this is nice to see. It's a bit of good news at a time when, frankly, I think it's good to see that we can still not be competitive and support one another and just enjoy this team journey together.
Right, right. You know, and I think too on that show, there's a competitiveness, no doubt. I mean, you want to be
Right,
the person picked, but you're not necessarily the right person. And
right,
and I think that comes with maturity too.
right,
These guys are more mature. And some of them realize, you know, she's wonderful, Joan's wonderful, but she's not wonderful for me. Like she's not my
right,
wonderful person. And so and that's okay. You know, not
right.
everybody's going to be for everybody. And so it's it was really interesting to watch it and really kind of compare to the younger, you know, the younger ones and the way they behave and the way they think and
Right.
right.
I can't watch that. That to me is just too much. But I really did love this Golden Bachelorette. I did. It's like,
Yes.
oh, I'm sorry to see it end.
Yeah, I did too. And she's wonderful and
Yes.
is just going to live happily ever after, a wonderful family. And so kudos to
Very
them.
precious.
Congratulations to them. Exactly, exactly. So, but now you could go on. You could be the next Golden Bachelorette.
You know, I think I'll pass. Last summer, I set up a profile on that free thing called Bumble that was created by a woman and gives women the choices, when I read the background of Bumble, I really loved it, the idea of it. I created a profile with my young neighbor, and she was very supportive. And as soon as I created it, I was exhausted and had to delete it immediately. So I don't think I have the energy to meet a bunch of strangers. I just don't anymore. Maybe I will, but this isn't the time.
Right, right.
Maybe
And it's
next month.
yeah, maybe next year,
Yeah,
maybe.
2025.
Yes, well, yeah. I mean, and I personally, I'm cool with being alone. Like
Yes,
you got to kind of like yourself and like
right.
being alone, and I do, and so it works for me. And I got a dog, so
Yay. Yes.
who loves me unconditionally. Isn't
I
it
love that.
wonderful? I know. I
Yes.
know. Yeah, yeah. So you have so much wisdom because with going through stuff, going through trauma and coming out on the other end has to come wisdom, right? Like you learn and you grow and more than you want to, probably.
Right.
So in all of your wisdom, what's the greatest piece of advice anyone's given you in life in general?
Well, I have had so much. I really have, because I was like a sponge when all of the things were going down with my kids. I didn't have a mom or a dad in my corner, and really never had for any length of time. When I developed my own personality, my mom was like, thanks, but no thanks. So that's okay. It's okay. But I was always a sponge with older, wise people. I think one thing that helped me, and it could be deemed as very dysfunctional in some situations, but a person told me once, hey, you know what? You have 24 hours in a day. And when you're going through something horrific, you probably should pick 1 hour a day and devote it to this awful, awful thing. Have your meltdowns, your breakdowns, your tantrums, cry, throw things, whatever you want to do that hour. But the other 23, you have to be able to keep the needle moving forward. And so when you feel your emotions getting too out of control, and again, this wouldn't work if I had been in a real depressive state or needed medication or something like that. But in general, devote time to it, don't suppress it. but don't let it eke your whole day. Don't let it take away all the time you could be moving forward. Another thing, before I left or maybe it was right when I was leaving my husband, a woman told me, you're going to have to learn to be your own best advocate. There are billions of people in the world, all with their own sad stories. You have to make people, every time you go for help, want to help you. They
Mm,
need to want to help you and know why it would matter. And that's hard because we do have billions of brothers and sisters in this earth. But sometimes we have to be able to say, here's why, please help, here's why. And
right.
here's why it's a good investment for you in some way. So
Yeah. Right, right. And you do have to advocate for yourself. That was really great advice.
it was.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And it can be humbling at the same time, right?
Definitely awful. I mean, that was exactly what I would never want to have happen. But you know what? It's what we have to do sometimes. It's okay.
Right. Right. And people want to help. So,
Right.
yes. So it's okay. It's okay. Just like you said. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And I love the way that the advice of giving it an hour a day, I got that advice from a counselor one time when I
I
went
love it.
after my father died. She told me, get a box, put stuff in the box because I was afraid
Right.
grieving was going to take over my life. Like if I started, I wouldn't be able to stop.
I
Would I check
understand.
myself into a hotel and just stay for a few days and just cry? But I was afraid I would not stop crying and I would now be living in a hotel. And
Right.
so she recommended to get a box, put stuff that reminded me of him, and trinkets, pictures, whatever, with the lid and put it on a shelf. And then for half an hour a day, get it down from the shelf, open it up, look at everything, cry, 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 and then put it all back in, the lid back on and put it back on the shelf. And, I did that. I got the box, I got the stuff, but I never took it off the shelf because all what it did for me was show me I could do it in chunks. That I didn't have to grieve all my grieving all at once. It was okay to do it in chunks. And so, basically the same thing for you is that
Right.
because would be consuming. It is consuming when you lose somebody, it can be consuming. Your daughter's away, of course, consuming. And so to be able to put it into a time frame instead of it take over every minute of every day had to be mentally helpful, emotionally helpful, physically helpful. And so what great advice.
It was. It was great advice. We can really burn out our support systems if we allow tragedy to become the topic of every conversation when we're going through it. And it was also important in that way to remember, like, okay, don't forget to ask about them. Oh, they had a birthday. Don't forget to reach out to them because it feels like it's all about us in the midst of it, but it's really not. So it was very helpful.
Yeah, yeah, no kidding. Helpful for everyone to hear. I love it. So you just were in Alaska, got to see the girls, got to see the grand animals that you have, right?
Right.
Yeah. And so is it wonderful going back? Is it hard to go back? What is it like for you?
It's weird because when I got off the plane, it was like I'd never left. It was like, oh, like I'd been there the day before. So it was fine going back. I didn't say to myself, I really wish I lived here. When I left, I was ready to leave. But it was so great to see the girls in their natural habitat. And, I love it and want to go a little more often. But, 50 plus years in Alaska is a long time.
That is a long time. Yes. A long time with a lot of dark days.
Yes.
No sun. Yes. Yeah. Well, this has really been great. I thank you so much for being here and thank you for being so vulnerable, sharing your story. And I'm sure it's going to help people. And because there were a few incredible things that you said, everything you said was great. But service,
Thank you.
giving back is so
Thank
important as
you.
well and gets you out of yourself, which is so healing as well. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And so where can people find you? How do you want them to connect with you?
Yay. Oh, and it's been such a joy to be on Love Is. I am so thankful, Cam, and I adored when you were on my show. I can be found at lameredith.com. That's my first and middle initial, lameredith.com, my website. I have the podcast Persistence You with Lizbeth, where you can hear wherever you listen to podcasts, and it's also on YouTube. And of course, I'm on social media. And so thank you.
Yes, absolutely. All right. Well, thank you, Lizbeth. Thank you for the show. Thank you for joining us today. And I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And until we see each other again, be blessed.